Good morning, everybody. I guess it's still morning. Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Goodman. I'm the director of the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance, the statewide nonprofit historic preservation group. I think you know this session is part of a continuing series of educational programs we do for both people working on community projects as well as old property owners. We do a wide variety of things at the Preservation Alliance: technical assistance, coaching, grant making. It's all designed really to encourage more investment in our special historic places, raise more awareness of preservation techniques and benefits, and grow the movement, have more people doing and thinking about historic preservation. Just going to do a couple quick introductions before I get into the meat of the program today on preservation easements. I have two colleagues with me, Beverly Thomas at the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance and Nicole Flynn. They work with old house and barn owners and community projects, respectively, and do a lot of other things too. We have a board member, Rebecca Mitchell, really have a fabulous board, and she's a great member. She also has a great resume of positive impact in Stratham, where she lives, with the Heritage Commission and other ways too. And Laura Black, who's, there's Laura. She's with the Division of Historical Resources, the State Historic Preservation Office. Both she and Rebecca are going to talk a little bit towards the end of the program, sort of introduce themselves relative to easements. And we're pleased to have a duo and another very engaged in civic activities at the local level in Lyme and Orford with us to give a few profiles. They are Tim and Lynn Cook. You want to wave, Tim and Lynn Cook? And they're going to shoot over the visuals so we can see Carl Schmidt, who's in Orford. Great to have you all with us. And I appreciate the attendees today. I think you're a mix of folks who are working with individual buildings, either your own or another, or are working on community projects. And we hope by the end of this session, you get your questions answered relative to preservation easements and how they could potentially be a useful tool for you, either now or in the future. So here we go. I'm gonna warm up with some overview comments about easements, and Beverly's going to step in and just show you some images of eased properties, just to give you a sense of their diversity of property types and sort of introduce you to how easements are used. Then we're going to hear some short profiles from Tim and Lynn Cook in Lyme and Carl Schmidt in Orford to give you some practical information about some actual easement properties. Open it up to some questions from all of you. Make sure your questions are answered. And then, as I mentioned before, we're just going to talk more about the who does what. We're going to hear a bit from Laura Black at the Division of Historical Resources and Rebecca Mitchell in Stratham, and should have enough time to have some back and forth with whatever else you want to talk about. So ready to go? Ready to go? Thanks again for being with us. I often start by just describing how preservation easements are a sister of conservation easements. They're based in the same state and federal law and perform in some of the same ways. They're voluntary legal agreements, and they're individually crafted so they can have different terms attached to them. I think they're underused and sort of lesser known than their conservation easement sisters, and it's in forums like this that we hope to shed more light on how they might be useful in community project settings or for individual properties, sort of at the individual property level. There's, as I said before, preservation easements can be used with different kinds of property. They can have different levels of protection, and they're tactically sort of used in different ways. So today we're going to hear from a homeowner project that used a preservation easement. They actually had conservation easements side by side. They were used in grant making to sort of guard that public investment, that grant investment. And they're also used maybe more like, in the conservation world to meet a community benefit, to provide an extra level of protection tactic when a community group is trying to save or steward a historic property. So again, there are these legal agreements that are individually crafted. You know, they're done by a willing owner, property owner, any kind of property owner. And then the easement protection part is held by a second party, has to be a qualified organization. They hold the rights and responsibilities and make sure the easement terms are upheld. So again, back to my conservation analogy, you know, land trusts, state and regional nonprofits and agencies are holding conservation easements, and there's some similarities. There are similarities in the historic preservation world. I'll start with a little historic note that actually early users of this easement legal tool, preservation easement legal tool in New Hampshire were Strawberry Bank, and we can ask James Garvin about that, and Historic Harrisville, where those two different nonprofits were doing, you know, really innovative and important work in the middle of the 20th century to save and then wanted to steward important historic properties, but not necessarily hold them for their own, hold them in fee, hold the whole property interest. So they used this tool of preservation easements as they made those properties available to other owners, private owners, but were guarding, you know, their goals and their investment with the preservation easement. So a few local organizations got us going in New Hampshire, local nonprofits. Today, the Preservation Alliance holds easements, our group holds easements, National Trust, Historic New England. We're going to hear from Laura how on the public sector side, Division of Historical Resources holds some easements. And on the local level, sort of circling back to local, heritage commissions, which are still a newish invention and body in New Hampshire, also have the legal rights to own or hold property and also participate by holding preservation easements. And Becky's going to talk a little bit about that. So the property owner and that other entity are the two sides of that legal relationship. Just going to talk a little bit more about some big concepts before I pass it over to Lynn and Tim to talk about an individual property that has a preservation easement on it. I said before that easements are individually crafted, and I like to think of the old three-legged stool analogy when you're sort of thinking about what the ingredients are to create that individualized easement. And this is speaking from the Preservation Alliance perspective, but I think it's true of other easement holding organizations as well. Understanding the significance and what the important features of that property to protect is obviously really important. That's a big leg of the stool. As are the owner's wishes. What are the motivations of the owner that this easement is being negotiated with? What do they want to see for this property into the future? And then I think a very important leg of the third leg has to do with flexibility and viability, that these protection terms are done with an eye to the future. How's this property going to be lived in, used, occupied, sold to a future owner in the future? How do we make sure that it has enough flexibility balanced with this protection to make sure it's an effective tool going forward? Having said that, a preservation easement would almost always prohibit demolition, prohibit, you know, really big things like demolition that would undermine the idea of protecting this property. And typically there's a set of features in the easement that are outlined in the easement that the owner would need approval to alter certain significant features. And then there's things that the owner just continues to be able to do as of right, permitted activities that are laid out in the preservation easement. It's very typical to protect the exterior of a building, sort of what's in the public view in a preservation easement, but there's certainly examples, and we'll show you some, of wanting to protect really important interior features of a historic resource. There's also protection and guidance in certain easements relative to the building's context, its cultural landscape, could be the interrelationship of new buildings, or offer guidance about new construction. those are things that are very much in the mix too, in addition to exteriors and perhaps interiors. Typically an easement is silent on use. I think some easements do kind of venture into that territory, but you're typically protecting certain architectural features that might have an effect on how the building can be used in the future, but typically don't talk about use of the property, use of the structure. Easements tend to be permanent legal agreements that pass from owner to owner, although there is such a thing as term easements, which are often used in grant making to protect and have that easement exist for a certain term that's kind of proportional to the investment that's been made in it by a grantor. So I just wanted to make that point that often permanent, but can have a certain term attached to it. And people often ask about how it works into the future. And these are recorded legal documents recorded on the deed, and that deed restriction passes from owner to owner. That how an easement affects the value of a property can really change from property to property. It really depends on what the highest and best use and market conditions and pressures might be on a certain property. Could have a little effect, could have a really big effect. We can talk a little bit about that later. And when we talk about kind of the marketability and saleability of eased properties, this tool has been around for a long time, and there's a growing body of evidence about how it can affect who's interested in buying the property, just like certain people might be interested in buying a property that's in a local historic district or not. We talk about how an easement could potentially narrow the pool of interested buyers for a property with a preservation easement on it. But again, the value issue really varies property to property. So we can talk more about kind of cost savings, use, and other issues later, if that's okay with you. We were gonna show you some images of some properties with easements on it, and then turn to our two little profile case studies, if that sounds good. So I'm gonna share screen. And here we go. Here's Beverly from beginning. Talk a little bit about sort of the variety of property types and what protection can look like, I guess. Does that sound good?
Yep, great. Thank you, Jennifer. Jennifer has asked me to do this one reason because I help monitor the easement, which means all the easements. I visit the properties each year, speak with the property owners, talk about upcoming projects or projects they've done, and just make sure that the terms of the easement are being upheld. So the first one is Stanley Tap. So all these, as Jennifer had mentioned, are perpetual easements that we hold. We do not hold any term easements currently. And we have a great diversity of easement properties. First one here is Stanley Tavern on Main Street in Hopkinton. This building actually had been divided up into apartments. I'm not quite sure how many, 3 or 4. And the family purchased the building and restored it to its original tavern architecture and configuration. So they did a fabulous job doing this work and wanted to protect their investment in the property. So put an easement on it. Next. All right. This is the Jocelyn Faulkner Putnam House on Court Street in Keene. Our newest easement property. It's an amazing 1890 Queen Anne style house, extremely well preserved, and the family recognized that, interested in possibly putting it on the market, which actually it is on the market now, but this property also has an outbuilding protected. The exterior of the outbuilding is protected, but there are many interior features protected as well with this property. Next. Okay, this is the Pearl in 1857 church in Portsmouth. This church has significance. It's on the National Register. It's also on the Black Heritage Trail, has significance because it was the first African-American owned church in New Hampshire. They purchased it, the congregation purchased it in 1915 and held it until the 40s, I believe. It is now being used for commercial. There's a business in there now, but very significant building and being well preserved in Portsmouth. Next. Okay, Diamond Hill Farm in Concord. This is a side-by-side easement, meaning the farm buildings are all protected under a preservation easement in something like 300 or 400 acres of agricultural land in current agricultural use. Very active farm. It's really a local landmark. I'm sure a lot of you have seen it and is being preserved by this preservation easement, protected. Another side-by-side farm property. This is the Webster Farm in Franklin, New Hampshire. This property actually was going to be subdivided into house lots in a big community campaign to save it with some LCHIP funding. So it's a large campus of buildings dating from the late 1700s actually into the 20th century. Has had multiple uses in the past. It was the New Hampshire Orphans Home, Sister of Holy Cross, and recently a residential substance use treatment center. So it's quite a few buildings, all under preservation easement, side by side with the agricultural lands around it, which are being farmed. And these are Squam Lake properties. There is a type of easement in the lakes region to protect lakefront properties called Campstead easements. They actually protect the scale of the buildings on those lots, not necessarily the building itself, but the scale to prevent large from small camps being torn down and large houses being replacing them. Next. Okay.
These are profile properties, right?
Just a quick introduction. This is Lynn and Tim Cook's property, the Moses Kent house, early 1800s. Lynn and Tim have been painstakingly and lovingly restoring this property for X number of years, 30 plus maybe. Main house with an L off the back. You can see the top right photo is a beautifully restored barn, and the bottom photo there on the right is the barn when they first purchased it. And Lynn and Tim have really been doing all of the work on this property. And this too is a side-by-side where the buildings are protected under preservation easement and there's some adjacent land under conservation easement.
And look inside.
And the most amazing, or one of the most amazing thing in this property are the Rufus Porter murals that are in 2 downstairs rooms, downstairs hall, up the stairs, and in some upstairs rooms as well. Beautifully, they did restore the murals. They're gorgeous. And the murals are protected under the easement, as well as some other interior features.
Let's just look at the Orford projects and then we'll go back to Tim and Lynn. There's.
Okay, and one more, yep. This is the Rogers House on the Ridge in Orford. It is one of 7 ridge houses built between 1804 and 1838. This particular house was built in 1817 on the National Register. All the houses, it's a National Register district. This particular, so the significance here, one of the main significance and the reason for the easement is to protect the view from the main street in Orford. So this building, it's basically the main part of the house, the front block of the house that's protected, and there is some flexibility in the L off the back, but it was really to help protect the view from Main Street in Orford.
Great, thank you so much, Beverly.
You're welcome.
Here we go back to our group. So I suggested we were going to do little profiles of the last 2 properties that you just saw in Beverly's PowerPoint. So we have Tim and Lynn, who've lovingly restored that place that has the tout ensemble is fabulous, as well as the interiors, of course. Do you, one or both of you, just want to talk a little bit about what motivated you to want to do the easement in the first place?
Sure, I can give a brief history of the house and why we thought it was so important to put an easement on it. The house was built in 1811, 1812. And we think the murals were painted about 1828. That's the best guess. And actually it was Rufus Porter that painted them, and also his nephew, Jonathan Porter. The experts think that they both painted this house, which is somewhat unusual. And the murals have never been wallpapered over, and they're really in quite great shape. We had them cleaned, so 7 or 8 years ago, and a little touch up here and there, but they're really quite original. And the other thing about this house is that it, just by lucky circumstance, it never really got changed on the inside very much at all. It never had central heat or wiring until 1952. And when they did that, they did a good job. So we have 8 fireplaces that are untouched from when they were built, which is really unusual. So we felt that not only to protect the murals, obviously, but we wanted to protect the inside, all the original woodwork, everything in the house. So the easement that we wrote is quite strict. Essentially, the original part of the house cannot be changed. People can paint, but that's about it. There is an L that was added next to the old L that was built in 1952, which has a 1-car garage and a mudroom. And that can be altered or even torn down, and somebody could build a new L there. So that's
restrictions in the L too.
Yeah, there are restrictions. It can't be higher than a certain height, and it has to be built in keeping with the house. But that's a safety valve really for people if they want to do a new L there. But we just felt that the house was important enough because it hadn't really been changed, and there aren't very many houses left like that, that we just wanted to keep it the way it is.
Yeah.
So
nicely put, nicely put. And you've done some, Lynn, do you have anything to add? Not to put you on the spot.
I don't think so.
Okay, good, good. You've done some new construction, new outbuildings since the easement was attached. And
yeah, so I built a 3-car carriage house about 30 some years ago. We've actually been here 41 years, so it's been quite a while. And then 3 years ago, I took an old barn frame down that was up the road, a small barn, and I moved it down here and we put it back up. And so we have I wanted to save that frame. It was too nice to, it wasn't going to get saved. So
yeah,
we have a 40 by 50 foot old original barn that was here. I don't think it's quite as old as the house, but it's a really nice frame. And that's actually in the easement also. The barn is protected also.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that introduction. People might have specific questions for you later that we could come back to. Thanks for being such great stewards of that place and setting it up for good stewardship in the future, right? That's the big idea. Carl, let's turn to what was more of a community project that happened a few years ago in the next town to the north in Orford. What was going on with the Rogers house, and why did you think of an easement was a good tool for that?
Thank you, Jennifer. Let me just a little bit of background. The Rogers house is one of 7 houses on the so-called Orford Ridge, which runs parallel to Main Street or New Hampshire Route 10. But they're set back quite a distance from the road itself, actually sitting on an old ancient riverbank of the Connecticut River. Mm. And all of those houses are on the National Register of Historic Places. What prompted this was that one of these houses fell on hard times. It was the Rogers house, which is the second from the southernmost house, a wonderful federal house built in 1816 by a prominent local lawyer. The owner, the then owner of the house about 6 years ago, fell behind on property taxes to the point where ultimately the house, the owner lost the house, and the house became owned by the town of Orford. And the question was what to do with it. The select board naturally did not want to be in the business of a landlord, and therefore the basic idea was to sell it. But there was some talk in town, some of it perhaps serious, some perhaps not so serious, that one or more people intended to buy the property and make use of it as a storage, at least part of the land in front, as a storage place for construction vehicles and so forth, and generally not do well by the property, which all of those houses years ago were said to be a classic collection of federal houses. So the select board was contemplating putting the house on the market, and I became interested as a neighbor, basically across the street, to do something about protecting the property, and to see whether it would not fall into hands that would not treat it well. And so I undertook an effort to raise funds, working very closely with the Preservation Alliance in order to put a preservation easement on the property. And we were successful in raising the funds. The easement covers the front part of the house and all of the land extending to the west from it down to the street. That's the basic project, and I'm pleased to say that there were a substantial number of Orford residents who contributed funds in order to make this possible. But obviously it was working very closely with the Preservation Alliance.
Well, you were great to step in, Carl, and see that possibility when the property was changing hands, and work with the select board to promote the benefit of that, and got it done at no cost to the town, and in a way that they weren't stuck with that landlord kind of role that you referenced. So, and neighbors really stepped up to help you do that. Wonderful, wonderful project.
I should say that the idea of putting a preservation easement on the property had to be sold to the select board, because at least there was talk by members of the board that any kind of restriction placed on the property would inhibit their efforts to sell it. Mm. And so they had to be convinced, and thanks to Jennifer in particular, that it was the right thing to do.
And it's on its second owner since then now, used as a single family home and getting work done. And they've got a good document from the easement project to guide them, because there was a whole historic significance and documentation of the building pulled together as part of that, which is another part of this easement process for us. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I'm going to open it up a bit to see if people have questions. I know I have a couple of answers that I know I want to get across. And I'm glad that when Beverly started her set of images, she talked about the monitoring that easement holders do. And I wanted to take it a step further and say that easement holders I think I'm going to offer a generality, but and it's true for us, and I think for other easement holders too, that there's the fiduciary responsibility for an easement holder. Easement holder has to uphold the terms of the easement, but we're also there to be a resource too. So Tim and Lynn have a wide network of contractors and specialists and places to source materials, but they're unusual. A lot of people need help with those sort of ideas, you know, a specialty window treatment or an idea related to a historic landscape feature. We're here to be a resource for that kind of work, in addition to being the upholder of the easement terms. So I guess I wanted to make that point relative to easements too. It is a partnership of sorts for a property owner.
Jennifer, could I just make one?
Yeah, please,
point?
Carl.
It's important to know that the easement becomes part of the deed, and in this case, the Orford case, that to is registered with the Grafton County Register of Deeds.
Yep, and it passes to successive owners, and easement holders. So what range of funds are needed? So that's a good question. I don't know if people are looking at the chat. Did want to talk a little bit about costs and benefits related to this tool. They can certainly vary. I think the big cost that we talk about associated with an individual easement relates to having what we call stewardship funds into the future. So this is if it's a permanent easement or if it's a really long-term easement, the easement holder wants to know that they have adequate resources to be that helper, resource entity, as well as the enforcer, and ready to take on a legal challenge if needed for some successive owner down the line that's not adhering to the easement terms. So we ask for a substantial stewardship fund contribution that we think of as endowment. We treat it as endowment, generating annual earnings sufficient to cover sort of the operating costs. And I'll give you some numbers. ARPs have ranged from $10,000 for a really simple building to a major campus was 5 times as much, just so we have adequate resources to make sure we're doing that. And then there's other one-time costs, and it depends on how the easement is structured, whether the property owner is paying for this or it's paid through other kinds of fundraising. Some of these costs are tax deductible, some of them aren't. But those extra costs tend to be things like coming up with that, what we call baseline documentation that really pulls everything together in terms of the significance of the property and lays out what that property looks like at a certain point in time. That is the baseline then for that monitoring, for reviewing future projects, things like that. There can be other costs, those one-time costs related to environmental survey or legal or things like that that you might imagine with a legal issue related to real estate. On the saving side, it kind of goes to my point about value that I made before, property market value. That adding an easement to a property can have a little effect or a big effect on the value of a property, depending on those local market conditions. If it's a permanent easement and an easement on a property that's already been listed on the National Register of Historic Places or otherwise certified in a certain way recognized by the Park Service and the IRS, there can be a one-time federal tax deduction for that property owner if you jump through certain hoops. I'll use my conservation analogy again. You probably know neighbors, or maybe you have experience yourself where somebody took a property that had, subdivision or other development potential, and by adding a conservation easement, the property value was reduced dramatically because there wasn't that subdivision possibility. And in that case, the owner would could take a federal deduction over a period of time related to that reduction in value. And there is a version of that available on the preservation easement side. Kind of related to that, some property owners are structuring an easement, federal benefit related to gift or estate taxes. And then kind of related to that concept about decreasing value, potentially there's an effect with property values, a corollary in the property value world. So Beverly showed you those pictures of Squam. The property owners who are working on easements there were driven by love of place and not wanting their place that they love to be replaced someday by something much bigger with a much different use. But they were also motivated by operating costs. So in those scenarios, there were appraisals done. They knew that their property values were going to be lessened if there wasn't that developed potential anymore. So they had shorter operating costs. So again, it's different property to property, but on the benefit side, depending on the property and depending on how the property owner structures things, there's that potential for the federal benefit related to a reduction in value. And then there's an associated potential reduction related to property values. But I would say in our experience with the portfolio we have with working with individual property owners, there's tend to be more of a motivation from heart than going the dollars route. I'll just say that as an aside, although both are true. So there are true costs, and sometimes the owner's paying for it. Sometimes there's other charitable dollars or neighbor dollars coming to help pay for that. And then there's some potential benefits on the other side of the equation.
Yeah, Jennifer, if I could add something.
Please do.
I was just going to say that I think having a strict easement, as we do on our house, it certainly narrows probably the potential buyers, but the way we view it, I think, is that it weeds out people that we do not want to buy the property. It makes it easier in a lot of ways. So that's sort of what we feel.
That's a great description. Thank you for that. Other questions, wonderings about Rick? Okay, you have to unmute, I think. Oops.
I'm unmuted. So, hi. Can you talk a little bit about how easements are upheld and enforced? Like what happens when the terms of the easement are broken?
Yeah. I have a kind of a long intro to that, or I think the starting point is finding a good match in the beginning. So easements aren't for every property and they're not for every property owner. So I think for an easement holding, from our view, an easement holding organization, it's picking a property from the beginning that you think is a good match for this certain kind of legal tool. After that, I go back to the three-legged stool analogy and making sure there's enough flexibility, that we're not inadvertently creating these white elephants where there's no flexibility. How we're setting ourselves up for violations and problems later if somebody can't, people are living in a different way 50 years from now and there's no way to adapt the house or church for that, or there's no place to sort of have your own stamp of a new design or new addition or something like that. So at the front, we in the selection and the design, that's something that I think everybody has to really be thinking about. I think beyond that, you need a really good legal document that spells out how the kind of regular week-to-week project review, year-to-year monitoring, how that all works, just so that's really clear, so you don't get behind the 8 ball and in trouble as the two partners, that you're kind of on top of things. And the easement holding organization is a resource for the property owner, not just a regulator. Beyond that, the sort of standard legal documents, I think the best practices in preservation spell out all of your legal possibilities after that. It sets out a course for how to resolve problems. It sets out how to use mediation. It talks about what your legal remedies are and who pays for that. The easement holding organization could even put a lien on the property and how they're paid back for that. So I think both sides of the equation hope you never get that far because of the good work you've done up front and then the communication and back and forth through the years. But there are also remedies, and the easement holding organizations need to take those very seriously for the good of their responsibility relative to that particular property, but also in general, so that, you know, preservation easements are considered strong tools that are sort of recognized and embraced going forward too.
Yeah, in our particular easement, we were trying to decide how to protect the murals, and we thought about it for a long time, and we came up with if someone ever willfully damages or destroys the murals, they have to pay the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance the current assessed value. So hopefully that would be enough to be a deterrent to anybody. We were thinking about putting $1 million, but then we realized in 100 years, $1 million isn't going to be worth much. So,
yep. Yeah, very specific. Yeah, I mean, a lot of elements are irreplaceable, but that's sort of at the top of the pyramid in terms of and how we wanted to address that with the easement. Yeah. There's also provisions if there's, you know, casualty from weather or fire and what the process is to determine what you do next, what both parties do next, if there's an unexpected, you know, something out of your control sort of situation too. And again, these documents have been around, I think the laws we're using now are sort of from the 40s and 50s, and there's this great body of sort of work before us to be drawing on them for this preservation easement activity.
Another question. So I think I heard you say when an easement is applied to a property, there could be a reassessment of the value of the property. So someone's property taxes might be lowered. Is that sort of what you were saying, that
could be, yeah.
A benefit for the current owner, also potentially a future owner, to understand that if they're accepting of the terms of the easement and they are willing to abide by the terms of the easement, that they would own a property that maybe has characteristics that are of a quality, and that they wouldn't be subject to the same terms as if the property were not protected and on the open market.
Yep.
That's great.
Good point. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So back to the kind of players and who's doing what in this preservation easement world. I would just, if I forget to say it at the end, we're happy to talk to any of you as a follow-up. And, you know, we have a program we're really proud of, but for us, it's more about finding ways that property owners and advocates find the right stewardship match. So if it's an easement or not an easement, if it's with the Preservation Alliance or not, we're really happy to talk to you. And I know some of you are involved in grant-funded efforts in town, or might have bumped into the Division of Historical Resources and how they work with easements in the past. And we're glad that Laura could join us today just to kind of reintroduce herself and say a little bit about that. Laura?
Sure, thanks. I'm really glad to be here. This is sort of a, wonderful programming. There's these virtual programs that you guys have been doing over the past year. I think have been really helpful. So I run or coordinate the DHR's easement program, and it's definitely a different type of easement program than the one that the Preservation Alliance coordinates, and even the National Trust and Historic New England and other organizations. The key thing about it is that the easements that we take into our program's portfolio don't necessarily come from the private property owners that we see here, or the local communities that have a particular property that they really care about and want to protect into the future. We take in easements primarily for reasons that have to do with regulatory reasons. There's state and federal land transfers. So basically, if historic property, significant property that the state or the federal government wants to divest and sell, an easement would be put onto that property to protect essentially the public's interest in that historic property. Similarly, we take in easements for properties that have received primarily federal, but also some state grants. So if you're a property owner, an organization or a community, and you've wonderfully received a Save America's Treasures grant, then as part of that would come an easement at the end of that project, again, to protect the public's interest in that resource. Other ways that we take in easements into the portfolio sometimes have to do with mitigation for the regulatory process, as I mentioned, Section 106. So it might be an appropriate mitigation option that would go into the memorandum of agreement. That's not necessarily true for all properties. It's not a standard mitigation stipulation that we go to, but it's definitely part of that toolbox. So those are the sort of approach that fills our portfolio. But the way that we function is very similar to a lot of others. We review project proposals. And again, it depends on the easement and what's written into it and what's being protected on a particular property. We have lots of different types of resources, ranging from small, single family houses that someone might have purchased that from DOT, for example, if at some point the state had purchased some land for a project and they didn't need that house, that might get sold to a private property owner, all the way through public museums, Castle in the Clouds and Canterbury Shaker Village and the Fells all have easements in our program. We, also look at, we have a lot of different types of property types, not just property uses. So it's a little bit different, but overall, I think that the concept of the easements are all the same.
That's great. And thanks for sort of expanding with some additional examples that I think are great to know about if you're involved in a heritage commission or other community sort of group, or even a neighbor, just to sort of see how there might be protection happening around you through this tool of a preservation easement. So I had referenced before that heritage commissions have the authority to hold property and hold easements. In Carl's example, it was sort of an ad hoc group that jumped in to protect the Rogers House as part of Orford Ridge. Rebecca Mitchell could do a whole program on all the cool stuff they've been doing in Stratham, New Hampshire, over in the Seacoast related to easements. But today she's just going to give you a little teaser and more about kind of the approach, the varied approach that your Heritage Commission has used in town for a few different projects.
Thank you, Jennifer. And don't hesitate to shut me up if I get going too long, but I'll try to be brief. We've had experience with 3 quite different preservation easements, but they do have some common threads. The easements occurred when the properties were for sale, and each of them were being threatened to varying degrees, from incompatible redevelopment all the way to full demolition. And I want to say at the outset too, if you're in that kind of position, it's very important right from the beginning to get going on all your public education, and also pay attention to the recognition kind of tools that are available to you, whether it's just kind of a local recognition or being listed on the national or state registers. And I also want to add from the beginning that each of these 3 easements received a lot of help from the Preservation Alliance, and we're very grateful for that. The first one I want to talk about is the preservation of the Lane Homestead, which was listed on the National Register in the 1980s. It's a large complex of historic buildings, and it came up for sale and was threatened by redevelopment that would have demolished some of the buildings and changed the whole landscape radically. So we really mobilized quickly to get going on this, and on all the levels about education, recognition, and so forth. It became a 7 to save property, which was a big boost. So we started working with the Preservation Alliance right from the beginning. And we also benefited from an LCHIP grant that's put money towards the stewardship fund and all the expenses of negotiating that. But also the public education work was really important. So the town actually started, put up the funds, was voted at town meeting. And by having these funds available, it put the selling price of the property within the range of a buyer who could accept the terms of the easement. You can see the number of buildings that were involved in this. A similar property was the Bartlett Cushman House, but it was owned by the town. The town purchased this property because it is located next to our municipal center. This one was not yet listed on the National Register, but we immediately got it listed. We, meaning the Heritage Commission, got it listed on the National Register. And the town puzzled for a while to do what to do with the building. And the town select board decided they would try to put it up, market it for sale with an easement on it. And that's kind of sputtered along for a while, and people in town got a little bit anxious about how they'd shelled out some money to buy this property and what was going to happen with it. But things rallied, and a new select board came on. It was skeptical, and they decided that they would lop off half of the land and put it back up for sale. And at that point, we began to get some offers. And the select board worked with the Heritage Commission to develop the terms of easement. They were somewhat resistant to the Heritage Commission insisting that some of the interior elements should be preserved, but we stuck to our guns and kept them in there. And it ended up that there were 2 offers from buyers who were comfortable to work with the easement. And their response was, well, these are all elements in the interior that they would have wanted to preserve anyway. And we worked closely with Jennifer and other staff at the Preservation Alliance to put together the terms of that easement and to discuss and work it out with the new buyer. A more complicated one, but in some ways more simple, was the fate of our old town hall. The old town hall was built in the, this is a side view and an interior view. You can see the front with the gable,
portico, yeah,
right there. And, this was built in the 1870s. In the I think it was the 1980s, the town felt it was too small. They took over an old elementary school to develop a municipal center. So they decided to just sell this off. And you can see kind of what happened to it. It had gone through a variety of different uses, everything from this group antique shop that you see here. And it was sometime a judo school and various things like that. And all in private hands, but rented out. You can also see at the back a kind of lean-to addition that the town had put on. That was the police department at one time. The back of the building had burned, so that the interior had lost its stage. So the fellow who owned it a few years back decided he really, wanted to get rid of it, put it up for sale. And again, this was a case of we suspected something like this might be happening. So the Heritage Commission had begun early, really documenting the building. We got it listed on the state register, and we began to educate the public on the history of the building and why it was important to the town. So the fellow who ended up buying it really wanted to demolish it. And Jennifer and Beverly came from the Preservation Alliance, and we chatted with him. But it seemed to be becoming increasingly aware to the Heritage Commission that this wasn't really an appropriate easement for the Preservation Alliance because of the loss of some of the integrity of the site and of the interior. And so it worked out that we worked with the potential buyer to develop an easement that would satisfy his needs and the needs of the town. It was a bit tricky, and there was a lot of give and take. He benefited from RSA 79E, which is too complicated to go in on here, but it did freeze. The basic version of it is it froze his property taxes for a set number of years at the undeveloped rate. So he could, it really lowered his burden, and it gave him a number of years to recoup his expenses of purchasing the property and of renovating it. And we also really stuck to our guns in terms of, we'll give you this if you'll give us something else. So, you know, we said, yeah, you can have, you can replace the windows, but they should look like this. They can't have white ones. We want black ones and so forth. The guy was a local contractor. And so he was a little bit, you know, wanted to make sure he didn't be a bad neighbor. So it all worked out. And he started out as a skeptic of the whole business. And now he says he's really glad he worked with us. So that was a happy ending. But again, these are all very different cases. And it's a lot of work, but also rewarding.
Nice summary. Rewarding and a lot of work and rewarding. And congratulations to the Rebecca and the Heritage Commission for all that good work. I think it shows kind of the versatility of the tool and sort of some of the essential ingredients, I think. Thanks so much for that example. I'm going to wrap. Is there anything, Beverly, anybody else? Are we good?
Jennifer, there was one question in the chat.
Oh, I missed the second question.
Actually, there are two.
Oh, is there a sample easement form we can get? Yes, I'm happy to send out a bunch of general information on the easements as well as kind of our boilerplate legal document. That was from Kathy Northrup and Hooksett. And when you met with the Orford selectmen, was it what was your most effective argument for a historic easement? We actually have some of those documents, Carl, I think we could share. I think you touched on some of the main points. You really talked about how iconic the ridge was, how significant it was for Orford, that this work wasn't going to diminish the viability of the property, that the town was going to be able to pass it on to future owners, and that you were doing it at no cost to the town. I think those are three big ones. Does that sound right?
Yes, I mean, the select board certainly did not want to become a landlord, but I think their concern was to have it sold as quickly as possible. And I remember you provided essential help as well in convincing them that it was absolutely imperative that the property be protected from unwanted changes or modifications.
And we wanted it to sell too. So Laura Black is with the New Hampshire Division of Historical Resources. That was a question. And we're going to send you, I'm going to wrap by saying we're going to send you a follow-up email that has links to good information on preservation easements. Feel free to contact me and my colleagues and I for specific questions relative to your particular situation. Happy to provide more. Just wanted to also say that communication is going to include a quick evaluation that we'd love you to fill out. It helps us plan future programs. And we will be rolling out a set of 2022 programs, both virtual and in person, soon after the holidays. So welcome your feedback on ideas for programs and know that a new lineup is coming soon. Just also want to put in a plug for us. About 75–80% of our funding for our nonprofit statewide work comes from people like you, from individuals and businesses. So please give to our annual fund. We're starting that season right now. Gift memberships are always fun. Holiday gifts provided by the Preservation Alliance as well. Thank you for all the work you're doing in your communities and your participation in this forum today, which will be the recording of which will be posted soon. So thanks for being with us. Good luck on what you're working on, and we'll send you a follow-up email with more good links. Take care, everybody.